The wind rolled through the empty town, carrying the scent of dust and regret. The sun hung low, turning the sky a pale gold that burned across the land. People kept to themselves, heads down, afraid to look too long at anyone else's troubles. That's how it always was in the West, hard land, harder hearts. But that day, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. A deal was being made at the edge of town. Not a fair one, not a kind one. A man with tired eyes and a quiet voice stood across from another whose greed leaked from his grin. Between them, a woman. She didn't speak. Her wrists trembled not from weakness, but from the fury she was swallowing whole. She'd been promised freedom once, but promises in this town were worth less than dust. The rancher didn't come here to buy a person. He came to buy silence, maybe peace, maybe just something to fill the emptiness of his long, quiet days. He looked at the woman standing in front of him, head high, belly tense with anger, eyes sharp as glass, and saw something that stopped him cold. She was proud, broken maybe, but not beaten. He handed over the money anyway. The deal was done. The woman's mother, or the woman who used to call herself that, snatched the coins with a shaking hand and didn't look back. When it was over, only the rancher and the woman were left standing in the dust. The town watched from behind half-closed doors, whispering stories that would grow uglier by nightfall. He turned to leave, saying nothing. She followed, slow, careful, every step heavy with hate. When they reached his horse, she finally spoke. Her voice was low, steady, full of venom. "You paid for me," she said. "Now do it." The words hit him harder than any bullet could. He looked at her, really looked, and saw what she wanted, to be hated, to be treated like nothing. But he couldn't. He just turned away, jaw tight, eyes cold. "I didn't pay for that," he muttered. "Not for that." She stared at him, confused, furious. And then, for the first time in a long while, she didn't know what came next. The ride back to the ranch was long and quiet, the kind of silence that made even the horses nervous. The woman sat behind him, her arms stiff at her sides, refusing to hold on. Every bump in the dirt road made her stumble, but she didn't ask for help. Pride held her upright. The man said nothing either. He just kept his eyes on the horizon, the reins loose in his hands, his mind a mess of questions he didn't dare answer. By the time they reached the ranch, the sky had turned the color of copper, and the first stars blinked faintly above the ridge. The ranch looked like a lonely patch of life carved out of nowhere. An old wooden house, a barn leaning to one side, and fences stretching out into the open plain. The land was vast but empty, quiet but heavy, like it remembered too much. He climbed off the horse first and held out a hand for her. She didn't take it. Instead, she slipped down on her own, steadying herself as if to prove she didn't need him. He led the horse to the barn while she stood in the yard, unsure what to do. The house stared back at her dark, unwelcoming, worn from years of wind and solitude. She didn't want to go inside, but she didn't want to stay out either. He came back, dust clinging to his clothes, and nodded toward the door. "You can sleep inside. There's food on the table." His voice was flat, almost mechanical, like a man who'd forgotten how to speak to people. Inside, the air smelled of dry wood and old smoke. The table was set with a half loaf of bread, a pot of beans, and a jug of water. Everything was plain, no touch of comfort, no sign of another life. She stood there, staring at the food, her stomach twisting with hunger, but she refused to touch it until he turned his back. When she finally sat and ate, she did it quietly, almost angrily, as though each bite betrayed her pride. He didn't eat with her. He stayed outside, finishing his chores in the dark. The sound of boots on dirt, the creak of barn doors, the steady rhythm of a man trying to fill silence with work, it all echoed through the stillness. When he finally came in, she had already gone to the small room at the end of the hall. The door was half open, and she sat by the window, staring out into the night. Her hair hung loose over her shoulders, and the lamplight painted her face in soft gold. For a second he almost said something, but then he stopped. Words had never saved him before. The next morning she woke to the sound of roosters and the smell of coffee. The man was already outside, fixing a fence post near the barn. His movements were slow but sure, the kind of steady rhythm that comes from years of doing the same thing. She stood by the door, watching him through the glass. Part of her wanted to hate him, wanted him to be cruel so she could justify her anger, but he wasn't. He was just there, quiet, solid, uninterested in breaking her spirit. That made her even angrier. By midday, she couldn't stand the silence anymore. She went outside, picked up a bucket, and began hauling water from the well. He didn't stop her, didn't offer help, just watched for a moment, then went back to his work. The sun was brutal and sweat ran down her back, but she didn't quit. When her arms started to tremble, she forced herself to keep going. She wasn't going to be a burden. Later, when she came inside, he had left a plate of food on the table again. She frowned. "You don't have to feed me," she muttered. He didn't look up from his chair. "You're under my roof. You'll eat." That was all he said. Days passed like that, slow, quiet, uneventful, but something in the air began to shift. She noticed how careful he was, how he moved through life like a man afraid to break anything. She noticed the scar on his hand, the way he avoided looking at her too long, the way he sometimes stood outside at night, staring at the stars as if waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. One evening she found him sitting by the fence, sharpening a knife under the dim light. "You live out here alone?" she asked. He nodded once. "Always, long enough," he said. She crossed her arms, her tone sharp. "Why'd you buy me then?" He paused, blade glinting in the firelight. "Didn't buy you, I bought you out." She didn't understand at first. "Out," he nodded. "Out of that life, out of that man's hands. Out of a place where people stop being people." His voice was rough, not from anger but from memory. She didn't reply. For the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't have words. The days grew cooler after that. The work got harder, but she found herself doing it anyway. She fed the chickens, washed clothes, and mended torn shirts. He never thanked her, but sometimes she caught him leaving small things: a clean blanket, a basket of apples, an extra log for the fire. He didn't say much, but she started to realize that was his way of speaking. Sometimes she caught herself waiting for him to come back from town, listening for the sound of his horse before sunset. It made her angry to feel that way, but she couldn't help it. There was something about the quiet way he existed that made her feel safe, even when she didn't want to. One night when the wind was howling outside and the windows rattled in their frames, she woke from a bad dream, her heart pounding. The old fear returned, memories of rough hands, shouting voices, the sound of doors slamming. She sat up trembling, trying to catch her breath. Then she heard it, the slow, steady creak of the floorboards. The rancher stood by the doorway holding a lantern. "You all right?" he asked softly. She nodded, but her voice shook. "It's just a dream." He hesitated, then set the lantern on the table beside her bed. "You're safe here," he said, his tone quiet but certain. "No one's coming." She looked at him for a long time, searching his face for a lie, but found none. For the first time in years, she believed someone. He turned to leave, but before he did, she whispered, "Thank you." He didn't answer, just gave a small nod and closed the door behind him. She lay back down, her eyes still open, listening to the wind. It wasn't silent anymore. Somewhere in the house, she could hear him moving around, steady, calm, real. And somehow, that was enough to make her feel like maybe, just maybe, this place wasn't a cage after all. The days slipped by like slow-moving clouds over the open plains. Morning came with the cry of roosters and the scent of hay, and each sunrise found her already awake, standing by the window, watching the man saddle his horse. He didn't speak much, but his presence filled the air, steady, predictable, almost comforting. The quiet between them wasn't cold anymore. It was something else, something that made her heart uneasy in a way she didn't understand. She'd begun to learn the rhythm of the ranch, the way the animals moved, the sound of the wind against the fences, the small routines that made the days feel almost safe. She fed the chickens, swept the porch, cooked when she could. The rancher never asked her to, but he didn't stop her either. Sometimes, when he came back from the fields, she'd see him pause for a second at the doorway, as if surprised to find warmth waiting where there used to be only silence. He'd started to talk little by little. Not about himself, never that, but about the land, the weather, the cattle. His voice was low, rough like gravel, but when he spoke, she listened. It had been a long time since she'd heard a man talk without wanting something in return. And though she didn't say much back, her silence wasn't the same as before. It wasn't fear. It was peace. One evening she stood outside as the sun melted into the hills, her hands brushing the dry grass. He came up beside her, leaning on the fence, watching the sky turn red. For a long time neither of them spoke. Then he said quietly, "Storm's coming." She looked up at the darkening clouds. "You can smell it," she said. He nodded. "You learn to after enough years." When the storm finally broke that night, it came with thunder so loud it shook the house. She woke to the sound of wind slamming against the walls, the roof creaking like it might lift right off. For a moment, she was somewhere else, back in that place she swore she'd never return to. She sat up fast, heart racing, breath caught in her throat. A knock came at the door. "You all right?" His voice was muffled but calm. She hesitated, then said, "It's fine." The door opened anyway, just a crack, and the lantern light spilled across the floor. He didn't step inside. "It's just the wind," he said softly. "Nothing here's gonna hurt you." She nodded, unable to speak. He stood there for a moment, then said, "Go back to sleep." But when he turned to leave, lightning cracked across the sky, and she flinched so hard that a quiet gasp escaped her. He stopped and turned back. "You can sit by the fire if you want," he said gently. "Sometimes the noise sounds smaller down there." She hesitated, then followed him to the main room. The fire burned steady, the warmth wrapping around her like a blanket. He sat in the old wooden chair across from her, arms resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the flames. She sat on the floor near the hearth, hugging her knees to her chest. The storm raged outside, but in that little room everything felt strangely still. After a while she spoke, her voice small but steady. "You ever get used to the noise?" He shook his head. "No. You just learn it'll pass." She stared at the fire, watching it dance. "My father used to say storms were punishment," she whispered. "Said the thunder was the sound of God reminding people what they owe." He didn't look at her. "Your father sounds like a man who liked the sound of his own fear." That made her blink. She looked at him, half expecting anger, but there was none, just calm truth. She didn't reply, but a small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth before she could stop it. The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed. He leaned back, eyes soft in the glow. "You should get some rest," he said quietly. "The storm's almost done." But she didn't move. She just sat there, watching him, realizing for the first time that he wasn't the kind of man she thought he was. The way he looked at her wasn't ownership. It was something else, something patient, maybe even kind. She didn't understand it, but it made her chest ache in a strange, new way. The next morning the world was fresh and clean. The rain had washed the dust from the fields, and the air smelled like wet earth and new life. She stepped outside barefoot, feeling the cool mud under her feet, and for a moment she forgot where she'd come from. He was by the barn, fixing a broken gate. When he saw her, he nodded toward the sky. "Storm left us a mess," he said. She smiled faintly. "But it left water, too." He grinned, the first real grin she'd seen from him. "You're learning how to look at the good side." That simple smile, quick, honest, unguarded, stayed with her the whole day. She caught herself thinking about it while she worked, wondering how many years it had been since that man had smiled at anyone. Days grew into weeks. Their routines blended until neither of them could tell when they'd stopped being strangers. He'd fix things she broke. She'd mend things he wore down. The space between them slowly filled with small, quiet moments, shared meals, brief laughter, looks that lingered a little too long. One evening she found an old book on the shelf, its pages yellow and frayed. She brought it to the table. "You read much?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not since before." "Before what?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Before I stopped thinking there was anything worth reading about." She looked at him, understanding more than she expected to. "Then maybe it's time you start again," she said, sliding the book across the table toward him. He glanced at it, then at her. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was alive, full of something unspoken. That night, when the lanterns were out and the house fell into darkness, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She realized she wasn't afraid anymore. The man she once thought was her captor had somehow become her protector. The ranch, once a prison, now felt like home. She didn't know how it happened, only that somewhere between the silence and the storms, something had changed. And though neither of them had said a word about it, they both felt it growing, steady and real, like spring after a long winter. The heat had settled over the land like a thick blanket, pressing down on everything that breathed. Days stretched long and heavy, and even the cattle moved slower than usual. Dust hung in the air, clinging to skin and sweat, turning every breath into work. He spent most of his time out in the fields, hat pulled low, hands raw from rope and wood. She stayed near the house, mending clothes, keeping the fire low, and trying not to think too much about the way her heart jumped whenever she saw him walking back from the hills at sunset. He didn't notice, or at least she thought he didn't. He was the same as always, quiet, steady, his words few but never cruel. Sometimes he'd leave little things behind for her to find. A jar of wildflowers on the table, a polished stone near the window, a piece of cloth left folded neatly beside her sewing kit. He never said they were from him, but she knew. The smallness of the gestures made them even heavier. It was as if he spoke through kindness instead of words. One evening, the sky turned gray long before the sun went down. The wind picked up, low and restless. He looked up from his work, squinting toward the horizon. "Storm's coming again," he said quietly. She was standing by the porch, holding the baby blanket she'd been sewing for weeks. "Like the last one?" she asked. He shook his head. "Worse." The first drops fell just as darkness set in. By the time he'd gathered the horses and bolted the barn doors, the rain was already roaring, hammering against the roof like 1,000 fists. She lit the lanterns inside, her hands trembling as thunder cracked across the valley. Then came the sound of the wind, wild and angry, tearing at the walls. He burst through the door, soaked and panting. "Stay away from the windows," he shouted over the noise. The storm screamed louder, rattling the shutters. A branch broke off somewhere outside and slammed into the side of the house. She gasped, dropping the lantern, but he caught it before it hit the floor. "Easy," he said, steadying her with one hand. His touch was brief, careful, but it sent warmth through her that no storm could drown. The hours that followed felt endless. They sat together by the fire, the room flickering with light and shadow. The wind howled and water seeped under the door, pooling on the floorboards. She hugged her knees, listening to the chaos outside. He sat nearby, wiping the rain from his brow, his eyes fixed on the flames. After a while, she spoke softly. "I used to like the rain," she said. "Back home, it meant new crops, clean air." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "What changed?" She hesitated, fingers tracing the edge of her sleeve. "It stopped meaning hope," she whispered. "It started meaning hiding." He said nothing, just stared at the fire, his jaw tightening slightly. Then, after a long silence, he murmured, "You don't have to hide here." The words hit her harder than she expected. Simple, quiet, but real. She looked at him, and in that moment the storm outside seemed to fade a little. Suddenly, there was a crash from the barn, loud and sharp. He jumped to his feet. "The horses," he said. She stood too, grabbing his arm. "You can't go out there." But he was already reaching for his coat. "I have to." She followed him to the door. The rain was a wall, the wind nearly strong enough to knock her down. "Please," she called, her voice breaking. He turned just long enough to meet her eyes. "Stay inside," he said, "no matter what you hear." Then he was gone into the dark. Minutes stretched into forever. She paced the floor, heart racing, listening to the storm scream around her. Every crash made her flinch. Every flash of lightning sent panic through her chest. She pressed her hands to her face, whispering prayers she hadn't said in years. When the door finally opened again, he stumbled inside, drenched and bleeding from a cut across his arm. She rushed to him without thinking. "You're hurt," she cried. He waved her off. "It's nothing, they're fine." The barn's still standing. But she didn't listen. She pulled him toward the table, grabbing a cloth, tearing it into strips. "Sit," she ordered, voice trembling. He did. For the first time she saw him up close, the lines on his face, the tiredness in his eyes, the way his hands shook when he tried to steady himself. She cleaned the wound, careful not to hurt him. Neither spoke. The air between them felt charged, alive, filled with words they didn't know how to say. When she finished, he whispered, "Thank you." She looked up at him, her face wet from tears and rain. "You could have died out there." He met her gaze, his voice low. "Would have been worth it." The words caught her breath. She didn't move, didn't blink. The sound of thunder filled the silence between them. Then slowly, his hand reached up, brushing a strand of wet hair from her cheek. It was a small gesture, almost nothing, but it broke something open inside her. She turned away before the moment could swallow her whole, standing near the fire, her arms wrapped tight around herself. "Why do you keep doing this?" she asked softly. "Doing what?" "Caring." Her voice cracked. "You don't owe me that." He exhaled, long and heavy. "Maybe not, but I don't owe this world much else either." Outside, the rain began to slow, falling softer against the roof. The fire popped, filling the room with the smell of smoke and warmth. She turned back to him. "You should rest," she said, but her voice shook. He didn't move. "You should stop running," he replied. Her throat tightened. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then she walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. When she reached him, she stopped, just close enough to feel the heat of his body, the scent of rain still clinging to his clothes. He looked up at her, eyes tired, searching. She wanted to say something, to tell him that he'd saved more than her life, that his quiet had become the only thing that made her feel whole, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply reached out, touching his hand. His fingers curled around hers, rough and warm. The storm outside had finally stopped. The only sound left was the crackle of the fire and the quiet rhythm of two hearts that had somehow found their way to the same place, after all the noise and all the pain. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't dare think that far ahead. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel afraid of what might come next. The morning after the storm came calm and gold, the kind of light that made even the dust look soft. The land was washed clean, shining under the early sun. The air smelled of wet earth and fresh grass. He was already outside by the time she opened her eyes. Through the window she could see him standing near the fence, shoulders heavy, coat still damp. He looked different in that light, tired, yes, but peaceful, like the storm had taken something from him and given something back. She dressed quietly and stepped out onto the porch. The boards creaked under her bare feet and he turned at the sound. For a moment, neither said anything. The wind carried the faint cry of a hawk and the drip of rain from the roof. Finally, she spoke. "You didn't sleep." He gave a small shake of his head. "Had work to do." She glanced at the fence post he was mending. "You always have work to do." He almost smiled. "Keeps me from thinking too much." There was something in the way he said it, a soft truth she hadn't heard before. She wanted to ask what he thought about, but she didn't. Instead, she walked toward him, her dress brushing against the wet grass. "You should have let me help," she said. "You helped enough last night," he replied, his voice low. "If you hadn't been here, I might have left those horses to the storm." She frowned, her heart catching on the words. "You wouldn't have." He looked at her then, really looked. "Maybe not, but I wouldn't have cared as much." For a moment the world went still. The sound of the wind faded and all she could hear was her own heartbeat. She turned away, pretending to study the fence. "You should eat," she said quietly. "There's coffee on the stove." He nodded and followed her back toward the house. Inside, the air was warm again, filled with the smell of wood and morning. She poured him a cup and set it down. He sat at the table, his hands wrapping around the mug, eyes distant. She wanted to fill the silence but couldn't find the words. He finally broke it himself. "You ever think about going back?" The question caught her off guard. "Back where?" "To wherever you came from, family, friends, someone waiting." She let out a soft, humorless laugh. "There's no one waiting for me. Not anymore." He nodded slowly, staring into his coffee. "Same here." Something about those two words, quiet, simple, hung between them like the faint smoke from the stove. It was a strange kind of understanding. Two people who had nothing left of what they'd been, somehow finding themselves in the same place. After breakfast, she went outside and hung laundry on the line, the wind tugging at the damp fabric. He worked nearby, repairing the barn roof, glancing down every now and then. Each time their eyes met, she looked away too quickly. But inside, something was changing, something she couldn't name. Later that day, he found her in the garden, kneeling in the dirt trying to pull out weeds. Her hair had come loose, and a streak of mud marked her cheek. "You're planting again," he said, leaning on the fence post. "Trying," she replied, brushing her hands on her dress. "The soil's stubborn," he nodded. "It's this land. Hard to break at first, but once it opens up, it'll give you more than you expect." She smiled faintly. "Guess we've got that in common." He looked at her for a long second, then turned his gaze to the horizon. "Maybe we do." The days grew easier after that. The work didn't change, but the air around them did. They started talking more small things at first, weather, crops, the past in pieces. She laughed sometimes, a sound he hadn't heard before. He liked it more than he cared to admit. At night, they'd sit by the fire. She'd sew while he read from one of the few old books he owned, his deep voice filling the room. It was a kind of peace neither had expected. The house no longer echoed with emptiness. It breathed. But peace in the West was fragile. Rumors reached town faster than wind, and whispers found their way back to the ranch. People said the woman he'd bought had bewitched him, turned him soft. Others said she was dangerous, that he'd gone mad for keeping her. He heard it all, but he didn't say a word. When she brought it up one evening, her voice shaking, he only said, "They don't know what they're talking about." "They think I tricked you," she said, "that you're a fool for keeping me." He looked at her across the firelight. "Maybe I am. But it's a choice I made." Her eyes filled with tears. "Why?" He didn't hesitate. "Because I'd rather be a fool with a purpose than a smart man who's empty." She turned away, her breath unsteady. The fire popped between them, glowing warm against her face. She wanted to tell him how much those words meant, but fear held her back. She'd been told before that love was weakness, that it was something people used to get what they wanted. But here, in this quiet house with this quiet man, it felt different. It felt real. One night she woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Her heart jumped and she reached for the lantern. When the door opened, it was him, carrying a small wooden box. "Couldn't sleep," he said softly. "Found this in the barn." She sat up as he placed the box on the table. Inside was a silver locket, tarnished but still shining faintly. "Wasn't mine," he said. "Must have belonged to my wife." Her voice was barely a whisper. "You had a wife," he nodded slowly. "A long time ago. She's buried up by the ridge." "Never thought I'd bring anyone else here after her." She stared at him, her throat tight. "And yet you did." He gave a small, tired smile. "Didn't mean to, just happened." The quiet that followed was heavy but not cold. She reached out, touching the edge of the locket. "Do you miss her?" "Every day," he said. "But missing someone doesn't mean you can't live again." Her eyes glistened in the soft lantern light. "I don't know if I remember how to live." He looked at her then, steady and sure. "You're doing it right now." She felt her chest tighten, the kind of ache that wasn't pain but something deeper, hope trying to take root again. She looked down at her hands, realizing they weren't shaking anymore. The ranch, the wind, the fire, everything felt still. When he stood to leave, she said softly, "Good night." He paused at the door. "Good night," he said, and his voice carried warmth she hadn't heard before. After he was gone, she picked up the locket, turning it over in her hand. The metal was cold at first, then warm from her touch. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like someone bought or sold. She felt like someone who mattered. Spring came quietly, like a promise the land was finally ready to keep. The snow that had lingered on the hills melted away, and streams began to hum through the pastures. Grass rose green again where the dirt had been dry for months, and flowers dared to bloom near the fence line. The ranch looked alive, almost new, and so did the people who lived there. The woman woke earlier now, before the sun touched the windows. She'd start the fire, set the kettle on, and listen for his boots on the porch. Every morning began the same way, quiet, simple, but steady. Sometimes when he came in from the barn, she'd already have coffee waiting. He never asked, and she never explained. But those small moments said more than either of them could have with words. One morning, while she was hanging clothes on the line, she noticed him standing a few feet away, watching the sun rise. His hat was pushed back and his face was softer than usual, like the light had found the cracks in his armor. "You ever think about leaving here?" she asked suddenly. He looked at her, surprised. "Leaving?" She shrugged, folding one of the sheets. "The world's big, must be more to it than this." He smiled faintly. "Maybe, but not for me." "Why not?" He took a breath, eyes fixed on the far hills. "Because I've already seen enough of the world. It's cruel in too many places." "This," he said, nodding toward the fields, "this is quiet. I can live with quiet." She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her gaze to the horizon too. The quiet didn't scare her anymore. In fact, she'd started to crave it. The silence wasn't empty now. It was full of things unspoken, full of the life they were slowly building. Later that week, they rode into town together for the first time. The air was bright, the streets alive with the sounds of wagons, dogs, and people going about their days. Heads turned when they passed, whispers trailing behind them like smoke. She felt every stare, every word that wasn't said. The rancher noticed too. "Ignore them," he murmured. She kept her head high. "I'm not scared of whispers," she said softly. "I've heard worse." He looked at her with quiet pride. "You're stronger than most I know." In the general store, the shopkeeper hesitated when she walked in behind him, but the rancher's steady look silenced any question. When they left, he bought her a new shawl, soft and brown, the color of the hills after rain. She frowned when he handed it to her. "I didn't ask for this." He gave a small grin. "Didn't say you had to." That night when she draped it over her shoulders by the fire, it felt heavier than the fabric itself. It wasn't just a gift. It was something that said, "You belong." The weeks that followed passed with quiet rhythm. The land bloomed, the garden thrived, and the house filled with laughter she didn't realize she could make. Sometimes, while she worked, she'd hum, small, tuneless notes that floated through the air. Once he caught her doing it and just smiled, saying nothing, afraid to break the spell. But one morning the world changed again. She'd gone to fetch water from the well when she saw smoke rising in the distance, thick, black, twisting into the sky. She dropped the bucket and ran inside. "It's the ridge," she said breathlessly. "There's fire up there." He was already reaching for his coat. "Stay here." "You can't go alone," she protested. He turned, his eyes steady. "I have to. The cattle are up there." She grabbed his arm. "You're not leaving me here wondering if you'll come back." He hesitated, then nodded once. "Fine, stay close." They rode hard through the wind, the scent of smoke growing stronger with every mile. When they reached the ridge, flames licked at the dry grass, spreading fast toward the herd. Without a word, they split up, he driving the animals away from the fire, she helping to block the smaller paths with rocks and wet blankets. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with ash, but neither stopped. At one point she stumbled, coughing, her vision blurring. Through the smoke, she saw him fighting to cut a trapped steer loose from a fence. Without thinking, she ran to help, grabbing his hand, pulling the rope free. The animal bolted and he turned to her, eyes wide. "You shouldn't have come closer." "Then who'd pull you out when the fence fell?" she shot back, her voice hoarse. For a moment they just stared at each other, the fire roaring around them, and then he reached for her hand. "Let's go," he said. Together, they made it back just as the sky opened up with rain. It fell heavy, fierce, killing the flames and soaking the earth. They stood there, drenched and gasping, watching the smoke fade into mist. She looked at him, hair plastered to her face, and began to laugh, a deep, unguarded laugh that shook her whole body. He joined in, his voice rough but warm, and in that moment, everything that had been hard between them broke apart like clouds after a storm. Back at the ranch, they collapsed inside, dripping water onto the wooden floor. He sank into a chair, breathing heavily, and she knelt beside him with a towel. "You're gonna get yourself killed one day," she said, half smiling. He looked at her, tired but content. If I do, I hope it's for something that matters. She didn't answer right away. Then softly she said, it already does. The fire crackled again, and the house felt alive with the sound of rain on the roof. He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. His fingers were rough, hers soft, but they fit together perfectly, like two things that were always meant to find each other. Days passed, then weeks. The land healed where the fire had burned, and so did they. Every morning began with quiet smiles and shared coffee. Every night ended with the same warmth, the same understanding that had grown between them without words. One evening, while the sun sank low and painted the sky in red and gold, he stood behind her on the porch. She was watching the fields, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders. "You ever think you'd end up here?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, I thought my life ended before it began." He stepped closer, his voice soft. "Sometimes things break so new ones can start." She turned to look at him then, really look. The years of loneliness in his eyes were fading, replaced by something gentler, something sure. And though neither said it out loud, both knew what it was. It had crept in quietly, like dawn, slow, certain, unstoppable. The wind blew through the tall grass, carrying with it the smell of rain and soil and home. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and she didn't move away. The land stretched wide around them, endless and forgiving, and for the first time neither of them felt alone.